What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith and you just don't know where to turn, what a great opportunity we have for you for the next hour or so. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question about the Catholic faith, 833-288-3986. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply, at least for some folks. That phone number again, 833-288-EWTN. Michael Birchfield is our producer. Matt Kabinski is handling the phones, so he'll be the first voice that you hear when you call in. We also have Jeff Burson manning social media, so you can also ask your questions via Facebook or YouTube, if you so choose. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm a little on the sober side because of the death of the Bishop Emeritus, Bishop Foley here.
Bishop David Foley from
right
Diocese
here,
of Birmingham, our previous bishop, who was very well loved in the diocese. And I don't know how common this is in the Catholic world, but when he retired from being Bishop of Birmingham, he stayed in Birmingham.
He sure did.
And was a regular presence. He would minister in the hospitals and say Mass around the diocese, and highly regarded as one of the best homilists around, and an all-around great guy.
I heard one of his homilies, not that long ago, maybe a couple of months ago. I think it was over at Blessed Sacrament Church. He was filling in. That's what he did. And you know, he did not put up his feet and just relax and smoke the big cigar. He was out there all the time, and he delivered a fantastic homily. And I went up to him afterwards. I've known him ever since I've been in town, and said, could I please get a copy of that? And my wife was interested in that as well. He said, no, I make it a policy never to do that. I think it was a humility thing. I think he didn't want people going, what a great homily. Look at this right here. Look at this. But he wanted to keep that kind of buttoned up.
Well, he'll be dearly missed, but as I've said several times this morning, I think I hardly know anybody who was better prepared to meet the Lord. And he lived to a very ripe old age and had a very fruitful ministry and was well loved and extraordinarily sacramentalized, you should say. You know.
Yes, indeed. And we will carry the funeral mass, by the way, on EWTN television, and that'll be at 11 a.m. Central Time, 12 noon Eastern on Monday. So I believe visitation's going to be all day, pretty much all day Sunday, and then the funeral on Monday. So there we go. Hey, I want to lead off with an interesting text that we got from Travis, and we've tackled this a couple of times. But these particular names I don't think have come up before. Dear Dr. Anders, why aren't Moses, King David, or even Adam and Eve canonized as saints?
Yeah, thank you. I think we got to a similar question about a day or two ago.
Very similar, yes.
So the Catholic Church does actually regard the Old Testament patriarchs as saints in that we believe that they're in the presence of God, the beatific vision, and many of these characters are types of Christ in the Old Testament narrative, all right? In the Latin Church, the Western Catholic Church, it's not the practice to refer to them with the title saint, all right? But, you know, most people in heaven aren't running around with the title saint, you know, as canonized saints of the Catholic Church. It doesn't stop them from being in heaven. And there are rites of the Catholic Church that do venerate the Old Testament heroes as saints, and I've mentioned before, we have a Maronite parish, which Catholic Maronite parish here in Birmingham, named after Saint Elias or Elijah the prophet. So that does happen. As to why that is the practice, I mean, that's a convention that's come down through the centuries. I can only speculate, and this is, you know, sort of my. There may be a better reason, but my private theological or historical judgment would be that the Latin devotion to the saints and to their relics and to their shrines and so forth emerged very strongly in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries particularly around the tombs of the martyrs. And so these are people who had given their lives for the Christian faith in the Roman Empire in conscious, explicit imitation of the martyrdom of Christ. I mean, this is the way Ignatius of Antioch, in his epistle to the church at Rome, speaks about his impending martyrdom. He says, even now, finally, I'll be able to become a disciple of Christ and imitate him in his sacrificial death. And so, of course, that sort of became the model for Christian sanctity, the martyrdoms of the 2nd, 3rd century. And then later, the ascetical life, as Christians fled to the deserts and the monasteries to give themselves in a far more sort of consecrated way. But keeping in mind even that the tradition of monastic retreat itself does hearken back to the saints of the Old Testament, to John the Baptist and again to Elijah. And so the Carmelites, for instance, have a special devotion to Elijah the prophet, who went in hiding in a cave on Mount Carmel. It's kind of a feature of just the conventional use of language, but it doesn't reflect a theological judgment about the eternal state of these people.
Okay, very good. Here's one now from Angie, who says, a friend of mine is a cradle Catholic who's had a bad experience in a confession with a priest who was responding more as a human than as Christ. And now he struggles with going to confession. Also, the son of this person had the same issue with this priest. What are your suggestions?
Yeah, absolutely don't go to confession to that priest.
Okay.
Absolutely don't. And I've been very blessed in my Catholic life to have had wonderful priests in the confessional.
Mm-hmm.
The priest who actually won my wife for the faith was Father Angelo Shaughnessy, of happy memory, who died this year in March, I believe. And Father Angelus was just an absolute lamb in the confessional, and he once told me that he had asked God to strike him dead if he ever lost his patience or got impatient or harsh in the confessional, and he was determined to express only the mercy of God, Christ's compassion, and so forth. And he lived that out, and that's been my experience. I mean, the most uneventful confessions I have are just, all right, what are your sins? All right, here's your penance. I absolve you. Boom, next,
Yeah.
But I've never had one of these horror show experiences. Now, I understand that there are neurotic priests, because there are neurotic people in the world, okay? And there are immature priests, because there are immature people in the world.
Sure.
And there are people who can lose their temper and lose their patience. And is that terrible? Yes, it's terrible, all right? It does not vitiate, it doesn't invalidate the spiritual significance of what goes on. And, of course, the efficacy of the sacrament depends in no way on the personality of the priest. So, I mean, I'd be perfectly comfortable advising you to go look for a real dud. Go look for somebody with no personality at all,
Dud.
and someone who's just going to get the job done. And honestly, the confessional is not the place for spiritual direction or personal counsel.
Okay.
And so sometimes there are priests that like to get into all that, and that may be helpful to some. A lot of times it's not. Certainly it's not necessary. So go get yourself another priest.
Okay.
Also, I hope I'm not overstepping my bounds here, but my good friend Father John Paul of EWTN, of the MFVA, who's a missionary of mercy, has told me many, many times that he considers it to be sort of part of the competence of his ministry as one of the missionaries of mercy to reach out to those people who've been hurt in the confessional, all right, by some priests who lack sensitivity. And he has on more than one occasion apologized to people on behalf of the church for poor treatment that they may have received at the hands of priests. And he's a special guy, so watch him when he says Mass on EWTN.
Very good. When we come back, we'll be talking with Sean right here in Birmingham, also Judy in Cincinnati, and we've got lots more too. And look at this, 2 lines open at the moment. You can get in right now, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. It's called to communion here on EWTN.
Sharing the fullness of the Catholic faith. 1-833-288-EWTN. 1-833-288-3986. This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Have you heard about Church Pop? Church Pop features new online Christian content that's fun and inspiring every day. Find it on Snapchat, Instagram, and on the web at churchpop.com.
St. John the Baptist wasn't killed because he refused to bow to some pagan god. Herod, who had John beheaded, didn't care that much about religion. St. John ultimately lost his head because he wouldn't keep quiet. And more specifically, he wouldn't stop challenging Herod and his wife to leave their sins of the flesh. When we challenge people directly and clearly about sin, it can make them angry. When we simply call a sin what it is, that can make people angry too. But sometimes, that's exactly what God is calling us to do, and it's what love demands of us. I'm not saying we're supposed to challenge people all the time when we see them in sin or doing something immoral. Sometimes silence is wise. Sometimes we need to build up a friendship before we can earn the right to be heard. But when those times come where God is calling us to speak with clarity, we can either play it safe and keep silent or be saints. We don't get to be both. St. John the Baptist, pray for us. This is Chris Stefanik from reallifecatholic.com on EWTN Radio.
Lauren Ashburn.
I've always been pro-life, but have never been able to talk about it in the news. And now, not only do I share it internally, but I share it with a global audience.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-833-288-EWTN. 1-833-288-3986.
I want to take just a second to talk about someone who I consider a dear friend, and that is Jonette Benkovic. She has been on EWTN since longer than I've even been here, and she continues to do a fantastic job every time she's in front of a camera or behind a microphone. So please don't miss Women of Grace. Make it a part of your morning routine. It is fantastic. 11 a.m. tomorrow morning and each and every weekday right here on EWTN. We also have an encore on the weekends, too. Women of Grace couldn't be a better show, and it's not just for women. Let me point that out. Jonna cuts to the heart of the matter, and her advice is always so fantastic. So don't miss it. Women of Grace tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern, here on EWTN Radio. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Bree in Loveland, Colorado, listening to us via Denver Catholic Radio. Hey, Bree, what's on your mind today?
Hi there. So my children go to a classical education charter school in town, and we love it. Recently, my fifth grader just finished studying the Reformation, and so I was just reading through his study packet or the notes that they took during that unit.
Bree, do you mind my asking you who the publisher is of the materials that he studied from?
Core knowledge, I don't know exactly.
Okay, all right, go ahead. I'm sorry. The reason I'm asking is I used to work in the Protestant classical school movement, and I had some familiarity with the curriculum, and some of them are very, very anti-Catholic, and so if I knew what I was talking from, that would help. But go ahead.
Yes, and I'm not. That's, I guess, part of the reason, because they had three main issues that the people had with the church that led to the Reformation, and then three ways that the Catholic Church responded to the Protestant Reformation. So in his notes, he has the issues that they had were the indulgences, and the second one is the one I'm really I want to know more about, is the teaching of the church that are unbiblical, teachings of the church that are unbiblical, and then the third, that the leaders, corruption in the leadership of the church. So the second one I'm very concerned about, and then the three ways that we responded, he has in his notes, was to stop the Protestant Reformation. He didn't go into detail there. State clearly what they believed in. I think they looked at St. Ignatius of Loyola, and then to get rid of the corrupt leaders in the church.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the question. That's horrible, and it's grossly inaccurate. And I don't know if I can state it more plainly than that.
That's pretty plain.
I am a Catholic today because I dedicated 10 unrelenting, obsessive years of my life to the intense study of the Reformation at the graduate school level, and I did my doctoral dissertation on the theology of John Calvin. And if I never read another word of John Calvin again, as long as I live, I will definitely have my fill. Okay? So I know that of which I speak. And I often give public lectures on Reformation history, and I usually begin by asking the audience why they think there was a Reformation, what prompted the Reformation. And generally, and it doesn't matter if I'm speaking to Catholic audiences or to Protestant audiences, the answer will be corruption in the church. And that's the common perception, and it's represented in school textbooks like the one that you have read from. And I think that it is the most absurd answer I've ever heard in my entire life, because I say if corruption in the church were the sufficient cause to explain the doctrinal content of the Protestant Reformation, then we should have had a Reformation-style, Lutheran-style Reformation in the New Testament era, okay? Because if you read the New Testament documents, you learn that the church was completely rife with corruption from the very get-go, from the time of the apostles, and at every subsequent century thereafter. You know, I think it was St. Gregory Nazianzus who was nominated to be the Patriarch of Constantinople in the 4th century, and he absolutely didn't want the job because he didn't want to be exposed to all the clerical corruption that was in the church in the 4th century. I mean, you could just, when you look at the nature of the church corruption that was in existence, east and west, north and south, every single century. The Reformation, from my point of view, as an ideological movement, began not with Luther and Calvin in the 16th century, but with Gregory VII, Pope Hildebrand in the 11th century, and it was a pope actually who had come out of the Cluniac monastic reform movement, who said, okay, what the Cluniacs, which is a monastic order, did in cleaning up their own monasteries, that's something that I want to bring. I want to bring that dynamic to the administration of the entire church, all right? And he sort of infused that Reformation ideology, that sense of let's go back to the sources and kind of purify things, actually took its start first in the Catholic monasteries, then in the papacy, all right? And that sort of like, let's go back to antiquity and to the primitive alleged purity of the church. That ideology got picked up by the Franciscans. St. Francis of Assisi is just emblematic of that kind of thing. St. Dominic and all of the religious orders, which got cranking big time in the 12th century. And so for a good 400 years prior to Luther and Calvin, the ideology of religious reform and opposition to church corruption and purity of doctrine and faith and catechesis was absolutely endemic. It was ubiquitous throughout the entire Catholic world. I mean, Luther and Calvin were very, very, very late to the party, okay? And both of them were schooled in different schools of Catholic theology, but in Catholic theology. I mean, Luther was absolutely steeped in the Franciscan theology of William of Ockham and also Gabriel Biel. Calvin grew up reading Bernard of Clairvaux and Pierre Dailly and Jean Gerson and these great Catholic reformist theologians, and so that ideology of reformism was embedded into them by their Catholic upbringing. And the idea that corruption alone is somehow a sufficient explanation for the Reformation is just grotesquely naive. Okay, so, and there's another problem with that theory. The Reformers denied it. Luther and Calvin themselves flat out deny that what they were doing was responding to church corruption. They flat out deny it. All right, and in 1525, Martin Luther wrote a book called On the Bondage of the Will. And if you get a copy of the book and you flip to the end of it, it's an answer to Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus was a Catholic reformer who never left the church, who before Luther was famous for his critiques of church corruption. Another Catholic canonized saint, Thomas More, was famous for his critiques of church corruption. But in responding to Erasmus had written a book called The Diatribe on Free Will, because he said the real heart of the Lutheran Reformation is that Luther denies the doctrine of the freedom of the will. And Luther writes back to Erasmus and says, thank you so much, Erasmus, because you hit the nail on the head. And he says, a lot of people want to go after me about indulgences and the papacy and purgatory and stuff like this. And he says, those things are mere trifles and not worthy of debate. This is Luther himself, in 1525, On the Bondage of the Will. He says, papacy, indulgences, corruption, all that's trifles not worthy of debate. The real issue for Luther, according to Luther, was his belief that humans lack freedom, that we don't have free will, and that our salvation lies entirely in the predestinating and utterly arbitrary will of God. A position that he recognized to be logically and philosophically absurd, and thus he embraced the philosophy of absurdism. This is what he says in the document.
Yeah.
Okay? And Luther was an apocalyptist. He thought the end of the world was upon him. He recognized that his religious system would basically bring, fire and sword to Europe, and he accepted that possibility because of his apocalyptic worldview. All right. And I'm kind of running long in the mouth here, but the point of the matter is that's a very, very naive interpretation of the Reformation. When it comes to your second point about biblical teaching, again, this is a tremendously naive and jaded interpretation of the Reformation. Of course, the propagandists of the Reformation, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Cranmer, these opponents to the Catholic Church, framed their arguments as biblical, and they argued that the Catholic Church was unbiblical or had departed the teaching of sacred Scripture. Well, that's false, all right? But let me give you the judgment of probably the most respected non-Catholic Protestant English language biblical scholar in the world today. It's a guy named N.T. Wright, okay? Nobody has the respect of the world of biblical scholarship, I think, more today than N.T. Wright. And N.T. Wright has basically made a career out of the thesis that Luther was wrong. Luther was wrong in his interpretation of sacred Scripture, okay? And so his purported appeals to Scripture, to the Bible, were utterly tendentious, Again, this is one of the things that made me Catholic, is when I actually studied the Bible in the original languages in light of the writings of the early church fathers, I recognized how deeply unbiblical Luther's position was, deeply unbiblical. And a Protestant historian like Alistair McGrath, another highly regarded Protestant historian, has admitted openly in his book on the history of the doctrine of justification that Luther's theory of justification was a complete theological innovation, an invention that he pulled out of thin air, one that had no basis or precedent in the tradition whatsoever at all. And it's telling, it's very significant, that if the Protestant thesis were true, if it were true that Protestantism emerged from the pages of the Bible and that the Catholic Church was somehow a violation of biblical tradition, then you would expect something like Protestantism to have emerged in the Coptic Church of Egypt, in the Syriac Church of the Middle East, in the Chaldean Church of Mesopotamia, in the Indian Syro-Malabar tradition, in the Persian churches of the Nestorian churches and so forth. All of these ancient Christian communities, the Ethiopian church, the Eritrean church, all these ancient Christian communities that were geographically distant and remote from Rome, that had the Bible. You would think that something like Lutheranism would have emerged in these communities. But the fact of the matter is that Lutheranism only emerged one place, in Lutheran Germany, in 16th century Saxon Germany, for reasons that were highly local and highly political and highly idiosyncratic. It's not an intrinsically biblical tradition. It's a Martin Luther tradition.
There you go.
All right. Well, now, if you want a little bit more detail on some of these issues, please read my article available widely online. It's called How John Calvin Made Me a Catholic.
It's a great article, too.
And you might also take a look at the article called Tradition 1 and Sola Scriptura, all right, which deals with the claim that Luther's doctrine is somehow biblical or ancient, all right? And again, I'd love to... Oh, I know another thing. If you want to go to the website of the Diocese of Birmingham Office of Religious Education, all right, there's about an hour-long lecture that I have given on the intellectual origins of the European Reformation, where I go into these things at great length.
There you go. Bree, thank you so much for your call. Obviously, you touched a nerve with Dr. David Anders on that one.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. That opens up a line for you now, 833-288-EWTN, 833-288-3986. This is called a communion here on EWTN. Elvie in Tampa, listening via podcasting today. Elvie, we may not be able to answer all of your question before the break, but what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi guys. I have a question about Christ's hypostatic union. So I was talking to a friend, and I couldn't really explain how Christ is, I know it's a mystery, but he's one person, two natures. He came up with this idea that he has two souls. I just wanted some clarification or some material that I can read.
Yeah, thank you. No, Christ does not have two souls because the soul is a component of the human nature. So Christ, as a human, has a human soul and a human body. All right, he has a complete human nature. The divine nature is divine. Now, God is utterly simple. God is not composite. God is not made of matter and form or soul and body. Okay. The soul is a component of the human nature, not of the divine nature. So Christ, as a single person, has two natures. One, which is the divinity. All right. The other one is the human nature that includes body and soul.
Okay.
Now, if you want a really, really good explanation of these, read the Treatise on the Incarnation by St. Thomas Aquinas in the third book of the Summa Theologica, where he goes into minute detail on all these issues.
Very good. Elvie, thank you so much for your call. When we come back, we'll be talking with Sean right here in Birmingham. Also, Judy in Cincinnati, and we've got a line open for you right now, 833-288-EWTN, if you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. It's Called to Communion on this Wednesday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. Don't go away.
In Ireland right now, we are facing a serious crisis. The agents of the culture of death are attempting to have abortion legalized in our country. We cannot allow this to happen. In these moments, we are asking the EWTN family to join with us in prayer.
To join in prayer and to find out how you can help the pro-life movement in Ireland, go to EWTN in Ireland at EWTN.ie.
More to Life with Dr. Greg and Lisa Popchak.
More to Life is about living the Catholic difference in our marriages, our families, the way we approach life in general.
It's about celebrating life and our Catholic faith and discovering all the ways God wants to bless us and help us be a blessing to others.
More to Life with Dr. Greg and Lisa Popchak. Weekdays, 10 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Living the Beatitudes with Father Bjorn.
Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. This strange beatitude reminds us that Jesus is challenging us with his ways to heaven on a new exodus. We're leaving behind the Egypt of this world to find the eternal paradise of heaven. When we tend to think of happiness, we tend to think of it in a self-centered way, a possession of a temporary good or passing fancy. But Jesus is calling us into eternal happiness. And actually, morality is a search for happiness, says Dominican priest Servais Pinckaers. We're looking to be happy, and a lot of times we end up at dead-end roads that don't lead us to where we want to go. How can we be blessed when we mourn? In sorrow and difficulty, hardship and cross, we are called closer to Jesus. It's God's fingerprint in our heart reminding us that we're made for eternal happiness. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, two great apologists. Carlo Broussard will discuss how we answer the Protestant challenge, and Trent Horn will tackle why we're Catholic. Do not miss this. Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern here on EWTN Radio. And now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-833-288-EWTN. 1-833-288-3986.
Phone lines open if you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-EWTN. Here's a text that came in from Paula, who says, I'm Catholic, and my husband asked me why we are a Roman Apostolic Catholic Church. Is it because the Pope is in Rome? Do we follow the apostles' teaching? What say you?
Okay, thanks. So we're Catholics because Catholic means universal, and Christ founded but one church. He said to St. Peter, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, not my churches, all right, but my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. And when you read the New Testament documents, you see that the apostles themselves were consciously aware that the Christian church was a single institution that covered the whole world, and that they, as apostles, had jurisdiction over this one church founded by Christ. St. Paul, for instance, in the book of 1 Corinthians, says, if anyone wants to be contentious, know that we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. They're all in union with the one faith, one Lord, one baptism, one ecclesiastical organization. And Jesus also while he gave the apostles authority to teach and celebrate the sacraments and to propagate the faith in his name, he selected one of the apostles as the prince or head over all the others, and that was St. Peter. Again, in Matthew 16, he said, "Thou art Peter." Peter, of course, means rock. So it's effectively he's saying, "You're the rock, and on this rock I'll build my church." And Peter, the rock foundation of the church, is unity. And he says, "I give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." And that's a metaphor drawn from the Old Testament, meaning one that has administrative authority, okay? And the power of binding and loosing. What you bind on earth is bound in heaven. What you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. That's a metaphor drawn from rabbinic tradition about admitting or excluding, declaring clean or unclean, acceptable, unacceptable. That's all that authority that he gives to St. Peter. To Peter, he gives the command, "Feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, strengthen your brethren." It's to St. Peter that Paul goes in the book of Galatians when he says that he wants to receive the right hand of fellowship, lest he run his race in vain, okay? So one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church throughout the world with St. Peter at the head. Now Peter goes and ends his days at Rome. He ends his days at Rome. He's martyred at Rome. And so the authority of St. Peter passes to the Bishop of Rome, okay? And it's by universal acclamation and recognition and sacred tradition throughout the world that Peter did in fact end his days at Rome, and that Rome has this primacy of St. Peter on account of it being the Petrine, that is to say, of Peter, Apostolic See. But the answer to your question is a little bit more subtle than that, because within the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, there were, of course, different language families. There were those that spoke Latin, there were those that spoke Greek, some that spoke Syriac, others that spoke Coptic, and so on, okay? And so each of those traditions, according to the various regions and languages, grow up as rites, R-I-T-E-S, rites within the church, okay? And they were overseen by bishops of particular importance in those communities that we call patriarchs. Because you have a patriarch in Constantinople, you have one in Jerusalem, you have one in Antioch, you have one in Alexandria, Egypt. You also have a patriarchate in Rome, okay? And but the Patriarch of Rome also happens to be the Pope. All right, most of the other patriarchs are not popes; they're just patriarchs. Okay, but the Patriarch of Rome also happens to be the Pope. All right, so in one sense, when we speak about being Roman Catholic, we're talking about the Latin part of the church, right? For whom the Bishop of Rome is the Latin Patriarch over the Latin rite of the church. All right, and we're Roman in that sense. All right, unless you're from one of the Eastern communions. That's in communion with the Catholic Church, like your Byzantine or your Coptic or your Melkite or something, all right? But in another sense, we're Roman Catholic because all the Catholic churches throughout the world look to Rome and to the Pope as the vicar of Christ on earth and the visible source of unity for all that whole Catholic faithful around the world.
Okay. Very good. I hope that's helpful for you, Paula. Thank you so much for texting us today here at EWTN's Call to Communion. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. Let's get back to it here and talk with Sean right here in Birmingham, listening to us via the EWTN app. Hey, Sean, what's on your mind today?
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I had a question about the teaching of the physical presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And I've read through John 6, but can you tell me some of the teachings of the early church that prove that the early church taught that from the beginning? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Sources outside of Scripture?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so for starters, you might want to take a peek at St. Ignatius of Antioch's letter to the Smyrnians, where he complains about the Docetists. Docetists were a heresy that denied that Jesus Christ was actually incarnate. And they also denied, he said, that the Eucharist was really the flesh and blood, body and blood of Christ. And, of course, he rejects them on that account. So that's a very clear early testimony. And of course, Ignatius of Antioch, very early 2nd century, he was familiar with Polycarp, the disciple of St. John. Okay, another one would be the Apology of St. Justin Martyr, the first Apology, chapter, let's see, where is that chapter on the Eucharist? Hang on, I'll tell you in just a second. Okay, I was looking at the wrong text here. Where are you? Where did you go? I had it in front of me. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. Chapter 66 of the First Apology. This food we call Eucharist, of which no one is allowed to partake except one who believes the things we teach are true and has received the washing for forgiveness of sins and rebirth, and who lives as Christ handed us down For we do not receive these things as common bread. We do not receive these things as common bread or common drink, but as Jesus Christ our Savior, being incarnate by God's word, took flesh and blood for our salvation, so also have we been taught that the food consecrated by the word of prayer, which comes from him, from which our flesh and blood are nourished by transformation, is the flesh and blood of the incarnate Jesus. Okay. There are, a number of places where you can just sort of pile up testimonies of Christian antiquity. There is an article at the Call to Communion website on the doctrine of transubstantiation in the Church Fathers. You just look up doctrine of transubstantiation, Church Fathers, Call to Communion. You'll get lots of good references and discussion there.
Okay.
The website, therealpresence.org, is just absolutely replete with such testimonies. It's going to come to me in a second. The book, Early Christian Doctrine by, my mind is going today. Ever happened to you, Tom?
Oh, yes.
Early Christian Doctrine. Oh, J&D Kelly, that's the one. By J&D Kelly, gives you a lot of citations, not only on the doctrine of the Eucharist, but all the sort of main head points of Christian dogma. And Kelly's not even a Catholic. I think he was an Anglican.
Okay.
That's another good resource. So there's plenty of places you can go. Now, another thing that's important to keep in mind, which came first, the Eucharist or the Scriptures? The Eucharist came first, right?
Of course.
Okay. And so the Scriptures were written within communities and for communities that were already celebrating the sacrament.
Yeah.
All right, and the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And so it stands to reason that they would reflect the theology of the earliest Christians, all right, that predate the writing of the Bible itself, and they would be interpreted in light of the traditions of the church to which they were received. 1 Corinthians 11, I think, is our earliest, actually in terms of pen to paper, earliest account of the Eucharist, where St. Paul repeats the words of institution and then says, if you eat or drink of this bread or this cup in an unworthy manner, you're guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. All right, of course, all the institution narratives from the Synoptic Gospels as well as John 6. And then we have a 2,000-year history of consistently teaching this doctrine. So, I mean, this is the faith of the church is unambiguous.
Very good. Sean, thank you so much for your call, and glad you're listening right here in Birmingham. This is Call to Communion on EWTN. 833-288-3986 is our number. Let's go to Judy in Cincinnati, listening to us on Sacred Heart Radio there. Hey, Judy, how are you today? What's on your mind?
Fine, thank you. I have a sister and brother-in-law who have left the church. And I asked my sister yesterday, what would be your primary complaint? And she said, when the curtain was ripped in the temple, when Jesus died, there was no longer a need for Levitical priests. And then she also, therefore, there's no need for a priest in the Catholic Church as intercessors. And then she also mentioned something about there's no need for priests to forgive sins, that God forgives sins. So can you give any
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can do that. I really appreciate the question. So that's interesting. If the tearing of the temple and the destruction of the Levitical priesthood obviated the need for priests or eliminated for the need for priests or for the office of forgiving of sins, then why would Christ say to the apostles as soon as he rose from the dead, and this is, of course, after the temple curtain was ripped, okay, why would he say in John chapter 20, whoever sins you forgive are forgiven, whoever sins you retain are retained, okay? Why would St. Paul in the book of 2 Corinthians say of the repentant sinner who'd come back into fellowship with the church, I forgive him in the presence of Christ? Why would St. James in James chapter 5 command us to confess our sins to one another, okay, and to call for the presbyters of the church to be anointed with oil so that we might receive forgiveness of sins and healing? I mean, I don't know why Jesus would institute all these sacraments and promise his divine assistance. Yeah. Without qualification, whoever sins you forgive are forgiven, if he didn't intend for those sacraments to be used. And why would St. Paul refer to himself as a priest in Romans chapter 15, verse 16, all right? What is the role of a priest? It's to prepare and to offer sacrifices, all right? And why then would the book of Romans chapter 12 tell us that we have to offer the sacrifice of our very lives to Jesus? If all sacrifice is eliminated, then it seems that St. Paul's doing something wrong when he says offer your bodies as living sacrifices. This is your spiritual act of worship. And why in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 does St. Paul analogize the offering of the Eucharistic sacrifice to the sacrifice of the pagans, and he tells you to partake of the one and to avoid the other. All right. So the doctrine of continuing sacrifice in the life of the Christian church is embedded in the very words of Eucharistic institution when Jesus says, "This is my body given for you. This is the chalice of the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Do this in memory of me." And memory there is, of course, a very rich theological word. It's the same word in Acts chapter 10 when the angel says to Cornelius, "Cornelius, Cornelius, your gifts and prayers have come up before God as a memorial offering." Very same word. So identifying the Eucharist as a distinct offering of sacrifice, the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus being offered to God in perpetuity for reparation of sins and the reconciliation of the world. The idea of sacrifice and priesthood is all through the New Testament, all through the writings of the apostles, and something that is, of course, ubiquitous in Christian experience. All right, we find it all the way down for 2,000 years. So I think that the position that your sister has taken is a common one in Protestantism. And guess what? Protestants were 1,500 years late to the party. I mean, there's nothing like Protestantism for 1,500 years in the life of the church.
Right.
You can look east and west, north and south. You can look at Latin, Greek, Syriac, Coptic, Eritrean, Chaldean, Syro-Malabar. You don't find anything like Lutheranism or Calvinism, but you do find, you know what you find? You find priests. You know what you find? You find liturgies that celebrate sacrifice and worship and the forgiveness of sins.
Yep.
All right. You go back and read the treatises of the 2nd century church fathers like Tertullian's treatise on penance. All right. Clearly articulating the power of the church to forgive and retain sins. I mean, so I understand that this is a position that some Protestants take. Protestants, so I think you don't understand biblical history or church history.
Judy, thank you so much for your call. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. I want to tell you about a brand new book. It's available now from EWTN Publishing, and it's called Sanctify Your Daily Life, How to Transform Work into a Source of Strength, Holiness, and Joy. And the author of this book knows what he's talking about, Pope John Paul II's mentor, Stefan Cardinal Wyszynski. You can learn how to change any workplace into a workshop for sanctity for yourself and for those who are around you. Also, things like how to avoid burnout at home or in the office, 5 steps to praying in work instead of merely being at work, 6 virtues that work instills in you when you have the right attitude. What about office politics? Family stresses, how to diffuse these things before they do harm to you or your soul. 3 things that cause discouragement at work and how to eliminate them. This is a very practical book. Again, it's called Sanctify Your Daily Life, How to Transform Work into a Source of Strength, Holiness, and Joy. It's available right now from us, EWTNRC.com, EWTNRC.com. Brand new from EWTN Publishing. Great, great book. Back to the phones right now for Joan in Boston, listening to us on the Station of the Cross. Hey, Joan, what's on your mind today?
Hi. I enjoy listening to your show. I have a quick question. My niece was in her catechesis class for formation of confirmation with her friend, and the other day she was talking to her mother saying, "Oh, I'm so glad we're done with that stuff," because they had, I guess 3 women came in as speakers to the class and told them that they have to stay married to someone, absolutely no divorce, if they are being abused by their spouse. I think that she probably meant husband because the way the girls interpreted it. But and I was just wondering what the Catholic Church's take is on that, because abuse, I mean, yeah, you have trials in your marriages and you don't want to walk out the first time you have a problem, and you want to, try to save it at all costs. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to abuse, I thought that sounded kind of, questionable. So I just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, thank you. So we need to actually say several things about this, because the answer is not just a simple yes or no. Okay, Jesus says in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, verse 18, he says, "Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery, and the man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." And he says the same thing in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. The Pharisees came to Christ and said, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" And Jesus says, "No, it's not lawful." And they say, "Then why are there provisions for divorce in the Mosaic law?" And Jesus says, "Well, Moses allowed this because of your hardness of heart, but it was not like that from the beginning. And what God has joined, let man not separate. And the apostles are shocked, like you are, or like I am, when they hear that kind of rigorous language, and they say, if this is the case, it's better for man not to marry. And Jesus doesn't dispute that at all. He says, well, what's impossible for men is possible for God. All right. And he promised the grace to actually, sacramental grace of marriage, to make marriages last, right? And for us also be able to endure difficulties in marriage. And St. Paul also addresses this in 1 Corinthians 7. He says, a woman must not divorce her husband, and if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. All right. So the doctrine of the absolute indissolubility of valid Christian marriage, that when a Christian man and a Christian woman are validly married, all right, that there's no power on earth, not the Pope, not the President, not the Supreme Court, that can dissolve that bond. And if a validly Christian person leaves their valid spouse and goes off and marries another, no matter what the court says, doesn't matter what, the circuit court here in Alabama says, or family court or whatever, if they go off and do it, then they've committed adultery. All right, so that's the absolute rock-solid teaching of the Catholic Church. Now, there are two qualifications that I need to attach, because the point that you make is very true, that abuse is a horrific situation. And when someone, I had some crazy people in my family, and I had a grandmother who was the abuser, and she was beaten up on her husband and then her second husband after the first husband died. And one time my step-grandfather called my dad up, and he said, Louis, Mary's beating on the door with an axe saying, I'm going to kill you. What do I do? And my father gave the proper response, which was that I don't sleep where they're trying to kill me. You get out of there, right?
Sure.
And you get out of there, okay? And the Catholic Church says you get out of there. If someone's coming after you and they're beating you up, or they're taking drugs, or they're bringing their girlfriends home, or in other words, they're making life absolutely intolerable, all right? You get out of there. You don't have a choice. You get out of there, okay? But here's the qualification. If you're validly married, and that's a big if. That's a big if. If you're validly married, you get out of there. But you're still married until death, and so you don't have a right to marry somebody else. You don't have a right to marry somebody else. So does that mean, well, are you telling me that I might actually have to remain single for the rest of my life? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm telling you. That's exactly what I'm telling you. You might have to remain single for the rest of your life if you're validly married and your spouse flips out and, starts shooting people or whatever. You got to get out of there. And you might even have to sue for divorce in the civil court. You might have to get the government to come give you certain protections to keep the crazy guy away from you. Yeah, absolutely. But you might have to remain unmarried for life if you are validly married.
Right.
Now, there's a second qualification. All right. Second qualification is that in a situation where you got a crazy person doing crazy stuff, it's entirely probable that person was not of sufficient sound mind to actually commit to the contract of marriage, okay? And that the church would look at that relationship and say, we don't think there's a valid marriage here. And if there's not a valid marriage, you're not married and you're not bound. That's why the church has this institution called annulments, right? You can issue a declaration of nullity. The church can look into the relationship and go, we don't think there's a real marriage here, and therefore you're not bound. You're not bound. So that kind of takes the edge off a little bit from what initially sounds like a completely inflexible position. At one level, it is an inflexible position. It is an inflexible position. But it's an inflexible position with enough definition and nuance that it can be approached with great pastoral sensitivity. All right. Now, the important takeaway, I think, is that, somebody's coming after you, you get the heck out of Dodge. You get away, okay? But the other important takeaway is there's a cultural attitude in the modern West that marriage exists primarily for me and my pleasure or my satisfaction. All right?
Very cavalier.
That it exists to prolong or deepen or extend the experience of romantic love. And that when that fails, or when I no longer experience romantic attraction, or I don't feel good about it, or I'm unhappy, that legitimates my decision to leave. All right? And that is dead wrong. That is dead wrong. And the beautiful thing about the Catholic faith is that God promises us grace, not so that he can promise us a trouble-free, happy-go-lucky, subjectively satisfying marriage. That's not the purpose and end of marriage. The purpose of end of marriage is, first of all, to raise up children. And second of all, to get me and my spouse to heaven, if it's a sacramental marriage, to get us to heaven. Nobody gets to heaven without suffering. Christ said so. He says, if you want to be my disciple, you must take up your cross and follow me.
That's right.
All right? If you're not having some difficulty in life, all right, and willingly accepting that difficulty for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, we're not following Christ in offering our very lives. And if I'm fleeing every occasion of suffering, when I have an objective moral duty to bear up under it, then I'm not being a disciple of Christ. Okay? Now, I'm going to speak just a little bit from my own experience here. All right? Tom knows this. In June, I'm going to have a book come out called How the Catholic Church Saved My Marriage. Or actually, we changed the title. It's The Catholic Church Saved My Marriage. And I had some real hard times early on in my married life. All right? My wife and I were immature people with poor theology and a bad understanding of what marriage was. And it got pretty bad. It got pretty rough, okay? And it was once we came to fully embrace the doctrines of the Catholic Church, we're willing to embrace the crosses of marriage, and severe though they might be, and rely on God's grace to bear up under them, that lo and behold, everything got better. In fact, it got fantastic, and I have an awesome marriage, right? But we both had to be at that point in our lives where we said, it might not ever get fantastic. It might stay bad forever. And maybe God's calling me to a difficult situation. We got kids, we have a family to raise.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's not all about me. Maybe I need to stick it out forever, unhappy, and rely on God's grace to endure. And once we both did that, lo and behold, it got better.
How about that? Great. Thanks for sharing that, David. And thank you, Joan, for your call. We do appreciate it. Here's one now from Zoe. Zoe checking in from the UK. She says, I was talking with my friend who is a Protestant and from the United States about Lent and what was I abstaining from. This is regarding Lent. They replied, well, hey, God wouldn't want me to torture myself, referring to abstaining from their favorite food. So what sort of thinking or theology is this based on? I was fasting on the basis that God enjoys our sacrifice, not our torture. Many thanks from Zoe in the UK.
Well, sure. I mean, this is highly loaded language to say, well, God doesn't want me to torture myself. God doesn't want you to injure yourself, all right, because God desires our flourishing. But guess what? Self-indulgence is really harmful.
Yes, it is.
Right. Self-indulgence is really harmful. And one of the great spiritual maladies of the modern world is that we lack any drive or interest in self-mastery, all right, and the formation of virtue, habit formation in virtue, and therefore we don't flourish. We don't flourish, and we don't have happiness, we don't have love, we don't have joy as individuals because we're utterly selfish and we're the slave of our passions, okay? And so part of the discipline of Lent helps us to acquire self-mastery over whether it be our lust for food or sex or whatever bodily or concupiscent pleasures might drive us away from imitation of Christ and doing the arduous and noble good. But it also gives us an opportunity to identify with Christ, right?
Sure.
Who himself was a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, who died a death of torture.
I don't know about you, but I do not dread the coming of Lent every year. It doesn't really, it doesn't bother me. I look forward to try to figure out, okay, not only what could I give up for Lent, but what could I take up for Lent, as in getting deeper in prayer life,
Do you admire anyone who always took the easy road?
No.
We admire people who embrace noble sacrifice for the sake of some noble good.
Absolutely.
How are you going to form yourself to be that kind of a person if you can't even give up crackers?
Zoe, thank you so much for your question, and thank you, Dr. David Anders.
Thanks, Tom.
You know what? We do the show each and every Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, with an encore that same evening at 11 o'clock Eastern, and then we grab the best show of the week, play that for you on Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern. For our whole crew here, I'm Tom Price. Have a great day. See you tomorrow. God bless.